Close your eyes, relax, and open your heart to the indescribable beauty of music. In tonight's story, we will discover how a melody from a simple wooden pipe changes the meaning of life for a young boy and his mother. I'm Carissa Vacker, and this is an excerpt from The Sources of Musical Feeling by Vladimir Galaktionovich Korolenko. It was a calm summer evening. Uncle Maxime was sitting in the garden. The father, as usual, was occupied in some distant field. Everything was quiet in the yard and around the house. The hamlet was, to all appearances, going to sleep, and the hum of the servants' and workmen's voices had likewise ceased. The boy had already been in bed for half an hour. He lay between sleeping and waking. For a certain length of time, this peaceful hour had seemed to arouse strange memories within him. Of course, he could see neither the dusky blue sky nor the dark waving treetops outlined sharp and clear against the starry heavens, nor the frowning peaks of the courtyard buildings, nor the blue haze overspreading the ground, mingling with the pale golden light of the moon and the stars. For several days he had fallen asleep under the charm of a spell of which he could render no account the following day. When drowsiness had benumbed his senses, when he could no longer hear the rustle of the beech trees or the voice of the nightingale beyond the river, or the melancholy tinkling of the bells attached to the colt browsing in the neighboring field, when all these varied sounds grew faint and indistinct, it seemed to the blind boy that they were all merged in one harmonious melody, which made its way quietly into the room, and hovering over his bed brought in its trail vague but enticing dreams. The next morning when he woke, he still felt their influence, and asked his mother, "What was that yesterday? What was it?" The mother did not know what her child meant. She thought he was probably excited by some dream. That night, she put him to bed herself, and when she saw that he was on the point of falling asleep, she left him without observing anything unusual. But on the following day, the boy again spoke to her of something he had heard the previous evening, which had made him feel so happy. "It was lovely, Mama, so lovely. What was it?" That night, the mother decided to remain longer by her child's bedside to discover the solution to this strange riddle. She sat in a chair beside the crib, knitting, listening meanwhile to the even breathing of her son. She thought he was asleep, when suddenly his gentle voice was heard in the darkness. "Mama, are you there?" "Yes, yes, my boy," she whispered. "Please go away. It must be afraid of you. It has not come. I had almost dropped to sleep, and still it has not come." The astonished mother heard the child's drowsy and plaintive whisper with a strange sensation. He spoke of his dreams in the most perfect good faith, as though they were reality. Nevertheless, the mother rose, bent down to kiss him, and then quietly left the room. But she determined to creep round to the open window that looked out into the garden. Before she succeeded in carrying her plan into execution, the riddle was solved. Suddenly, from the stable, came the soft musical tones of a shepherd's pipe, blending with the gentle rustling sounds of the southern evening. She had no difficulty in divining the pleasing influence which these simple modulations of an artless melody, harmonizing with the witching hour of dreams, would naturally possess over the imagination of her boy. She herself paused and stood for a moment, listening to the tender strands of a song of Little Russia, and with a sense of relief entered the dusky garden in search of Uncle Maxime. Joachim plays well, the mother thought. It is strange that this fellow who seems so rough should possess such an amount of feeling. Joachim really did play well. He could even handle the more intricate violin, and there had been a time when, on a Sunday at the inn, no one had played the Cossack dance or the merry Polish Krakowian better than himself. When seated on a cask with the violin braced against his shaven chin and his tall sheepskin hat on the back of his head, he would draw the bow across the quivering strings. Hardly a man in the inn could keep his seat. Ever since Joachim had fallen in love with Maria, a courtyard servant maid, he had neglected his merry violin. In truth, it had not helped him to win the heart of Maria, who preferred the smooth German face of her master's valet to the bearded visage of the musician. Since that time, his violin had not been heard either in the inn or at the evening gatherings. He had hung it on a nail in the stable. Joachim had purchased from a traveling Carpathian mountaineer a wooden pipe. He probably expected to find it a more suitable medium wherewith to express the sorrow of a rejected heart, and that its sympathetic modulations would harmonize with his hard lot. But the mountain pipe disappointed Joachim's expectations. He tried nearly a dozen of them in turn, in every possible way. He cut them, soaked them in water, dried them in the sun, hung them up under the roof to dry in the wind, but all to no avail. The mountain pipe did not commend itself to his heart. It whistled where it should have sung, wailed when he wanted a sentimental tremolo, and never, in fact, responded to his mood. At last, Joachim grew disappointed with all the wandering mountaineers, having made up his mind that not one of them understood the art of producing a good pipe, and decided to manufacture one with his own hands. For several days he roamed with frowning brow through swamp and field, went up to every willow bush, examined its branches, occasionally cut off one of them, but he failed to find just what he needed. With sternly frowning brow, he still pursued his search, and came at last to a spot above the slowly running river, where the placid waters barely stirred the lilies' snow-white heads. This nook was sheltered from the wind by a dense growth of spreading willows that hung their pensive heads over the dusky and peaceful depths below. Parting the bushes, Joachim made his way down to the river, where he paused for a moment, and the idea suddenly came to him that this was the very spot where he was to find the object of his search. The wrinkles vanished from his brow. After carefully examining a faintly whispering young willow, he unhesitatingly selected a straight and slender stalk that bent over the steep, crumbling shore. Tapping it with his finger for some purpose of his own, a look of self-satisfaction came upon his face as he watched it sway to and fro in the breeze and listened to the gentle murmur of its leaves. It proved to be a glorious pipe. Having dried the willow, Joachim burned out the pith, and boring 6 round holes, he cut the 7th crosswise and tightly closed one end with a wooden plug, across which he cut a narrow slit. Then for a week he hung the pipe by a slender string, that it might be warmed by the sun and dried by the wind, after which he carefully cleaned it, scraped it with glass, and rubbed it hard with a piece of cloth. The upper part of the pipe was round. On its smoothly polished surface, he burned with a twisted bit of iron all sorts of curious designs. When he at last tested his instrument by playing upon it several tones of the scale, he nodded his head excitedly, emitted a grunt of satisfaction, and hastily hid it in a safe place near his bed. He did not like to make the first musical trial amid the turmoil of the day, but that very evening, trills delicately modulated, tender, pensive, and vibrating, might have been heard from the direction of the stable. Joachim was perfectly satisfied with his pipe. It seemed a part of himself. Its utterances came, as it were, from his own enthusiastic and sentimental bosom, and every change of feeling, every shade of emotion was forthwith transmitted to his wonderful pipe, which in its turn repeated it in gentle echoes to the listening evening. Now, Joachim, in love with his pipe, was celebrating his honeymoon. In the daytime, he conscientiously fulfilled his duties as a stable boy, watered the horses, harnessed them, and drove with the Pawnee or with Maxime. Sometimes, when he looked over toward the neighboring village where Maria lived, his heart was conscious of a pang. But as evening drew on, all his troubles were forgotten. Even the image of the dark-browed maiden lost distinctness as it stood before him enveloped in mist, faintly outlined against a pale background, serving but to lend a certain pensive melancholy to his melodious pipe. As he lay in the stable that evening, Joachim's musical ecstasy found vent in tremulous melodies. Just when his notes were growing most pathetic, he felt a tiny hand passed swiftly and lightly over his face and hands, and then, with equal swiftness, over the pipe. At the same time, he heard by his side the panting of one whose breathing is quickened by exhilaration. Beside him stood the small, blind boy, wistfully stretching forth his little hands. An hour later, the mother, on going to take a look at her sleeping son, did not find him in bed. For a moment she was startled, but the maternal instinct directly told her where to look for the lost boy. Joachim, pausing for a moment, was quite abashed at the unexpected sight of the mother standing in the doorway of the stable. It appeared that she had been there for several moments before he ceased playing, watching her boy, who sat on the cot wrapped in Joachim's sheepskin coat, listening intently for the interrupted melody. From that evening, the boy came to Joachim in the stable every night. It never occurred to him to ask Joachim to play for him during the daytime. He seemed to fancy that the stir and bustle of the day precluded all possibility of these sweet melodies. But as soon as the shades of evening began to fall, Petrusia was seized with a feverish impatience. The evening tea and supper served but as signs of the approach of the longed-for moment, and the mother, although she felt an instinctive aversion for those musical seances, still could not forbid her darling to seek the company of the piper and spend 2 hours with him in the stable before bedtime. Those hours became for the boy the happiest of his life, and the mother saw that the impressions of the previous evening held entire possession of the child, that during the day he no longer responded to her caresses with his former ardor, that while sitting in her lap with his arms about her, his thoughts would revert to Joachim's song of the previous evening. It suddenly occurred to the mother that several years ago she had, among other delightful accomplishments, pursued the study of music. After leaving school, and even since her marriage, Anna had felt no inclination to renew her musical studies. But now, as she listened to the piper, a sense of appreciation and feeling for the living melody had sprung up in her soul. The result of this was that she requested her husband to send to town for a piano. "If you wish it, my dove," replied the exemplary husband. "I thought you did not care much about music." That same day a letter was sent to town, but several weeks must elapse before the instrument could arrive in the country. Meanwhile, the same harmonious strains proceeded from the stable evening after evening, and the boy, who had ceased to ask his mother's permission, hurried eagerly thither at the proper time. With the customary odor of the stable was mingled with the fragrance of the hay and the smell of the leather harnesses, and whenever the piper paused for a moment, one could hear the faint rustling of the wisps of hay which the horses, quietly munching, pulled through the bars, and also the whispering of the green beeches in the garden. In the midst of all this, the little blind boy sat listening like one enchanted. He never interrupted the musician, but once, when the latter had been resting, and several minutes had passed in absolute silence, the charmed influence that possessed the boy gave way to a passionate yearning. He reached to grasp the pipe, took it in his trembling hands and carried it to his lips. Gasping for breath, his first notes were faint and tremulous, but by slow degrees he gained a certain mastery over the simple instrument. Joachim placed the boy's fingers on the holes, and although the tiny hand could hardly grasp them, he had very soon mastered the notes of the scale. Every note possessed to him an individuality of its own. He knew in which opening he should find each of these tones, whence to bring it forth, and at times when Joachim was quietly and slowly playing some simple melody, the blind boy's fingers would imitate his movements. As tone followed tone, he seemed to know exactly from which hole each one came. At last, after 3 weeks had gone by, the piano was brought from town. Anna stood in the yard and listened attentively in order to discover how the workmen hurrying to and fro would carry the music into the rooms. Surely it must be very heavy, for when they lifted it down from the cart, there was a creaking noise, and also much groaning and puffing among the men. And now he could hear their heavy, measured tread, and at every step there was a rumbling. When this strange music was placed on the drawing-room floor, it again sent forth a dull rumbling sound like the tones of a displeased voice. All this alarmed the boy, and by no means attracted him toward this new guest. He went into the garden, and thus he missed hearing them set up the instrument. It was not until all was in readiness that the mother ordered the little boy be brought into the room. With the best Vienna instrument as an auxiliary, Anna felt confident of victory over the simple, rustic pipe. Now her son is to forget the stable and the piper, and she will once more become the source of all his joys. She glanced merrily at her boy as he timidly entered the room, accompanied by Uncle Maxime and Joachim, the latter having asked to leave to listen to the foreign music. With downcast eyes and overhanging forelock, now stood bashfully in the doorway. Just as Uncle Maxime and her son seated themselves on the lounge, Anna struck the keys of the piano. She played the piece that she had learned to perfection. It was not a particularly brilliant piece, but quite complicated, and one that required a certain amount of dexterous skill. The young woman played it with the view of winning a victory. She wished to bind still more closely to herself her young son's heart, enticed away from her by the pipe of the hahol. But the fond mother's hope was doomed to disappointment. The Vienna instrument proved no match for the willow twig of Ukraine. True, The piano from Vienna was rich in resources, expensive wood, fine strings, the skilled workmanship of a Vienna artisan, and all the wealth of its wide musical range. But the pipe of the Ukraine had allies of its own. It was in its native haunts, surrounded by its own Ukraine nature. Before Joachim had made it, it had swung to and fro above the river, so dear to the boy's heart. It had been caressed by the sun of the Ukraine and fanned by its breezes until the keen eye of the piper had caught sight of it overhanging the precipice. The foreign visitor had but a slender chance against the simple native pipe, whose tones had first been heard by the boy at the peaceful hour of bedtime, through the mysterious rustling of the night and the murmuring of the green beech trees, with all the well-known voices of nature in the Ukraine that found an echo within his soul. There could, moreover, be no fair comparison between Anna and Joachim. Her fingers, it is true, were more dexterous and flexible. The melody she played was richer and more complex. But Joachim had the true musical instinct. He had loved also, and sorrowed, and animated by these emotions, he sought his themes in the surrounding nature, and there he found his simple melodies. The soughing of the forest, the gentle whisper of the grass, the old national melodies that he had heard sung over his crib when he was an infant. She was mortified to find herself so utterly defeated by a common stable boy with his absurd pipe, as she remembered the disdainful glance of the hole when her unsuccessful concert came to an end. A blush overspread her face. But every evening when her boy hastened to the stable, she would open the window, rest her elbows on the sill, and listen intently. At first it was with a feeling of disdain, but gradually the sound of the pipe had taken possession of her soul, and she found herself eagerly devouring those emotive strains. When she woke to a realizing sense of this, she began to wonder whence came their fascination, their enchanting mystery, and by degrees the bluish dusk of evening, the vague shadows of the night, and the harmony existing between those melodies and nature revealed the secret. No longer resisting the attraction, she confessed to herself, "Yes, I must admit that this humble music does possess a rare and genuine feeling, a bewitching poetry not to be acquired by notes." This was indeed true. The secret of this poetry might be found in the intimate relation between nature and those memories of the past of which it was ever whispering to the human heart. Joachim, with his greasy boots and calloused hands, possessed that harmonious, that keen feeling for nature. Then the mother became aware that her haughty spirit had succumbed before the stable boy. She no longer remembered his coarse garments, redolent of tar, but the pleasing modulations of the songs recalled to mind his kind face, the mild expression of his gray eyes, and the bashful, humorous smile that lurked under the long mustache. The whispering trees in the garden high above her head, the light of the stars in the dark blue sky, the violet mist that shrouded the earth, together with Joachim's melodies, all contributed to fill the mother's soul with gentle melancholy. Her spirit yielded itself in meek submission and entered more and more deeply into the mystery of that pure, direct, and simple poetry of nature. Yes, the peasant Joachim had the true, living feeling. And how was it with the mother herself? Was she entirely devoid of that feeling? Why then did her heart beat so wildly? And why did the tears rise to her eyes? Did not her emotions spring from her devoted love for her unfortunate blind child, who left her for Joachim because she failed to give him as keen a pleasure as the latter? Thus time went on, without bringing the fond mother any apparent relief, and yet she was gradually gaining a certain advantage. She began to feel within her own breast an influx of melody and poetry not unlike that which had attracted her in the playing of the ho-ho. Hope, too, sprang up in her heart. Under the influence of this sudden access of confidence, she approached the piano several times and opened it, intending to overpower the low-voiced pipe by harmonious chords. But every time a sense of irresolution and timidity restrained her. She remembered her boy's face, while with timid wistfulness she let her hands flutter over the keys. Still, day by day, an inner consciousness of her own power grew within the woman's heart, and choosing the time when her boy was playing in the evening in some remote garden path, or perhaps out for a walk, she would seat herself at the piano. At first, her attempts were unsatisfactory. Her hands seemed powerless to evoke a response to her conception, and the tones of the instrument failed to interpret her emotions. But soon she perceived that the ease and freedom with which she could express her feelings through the medium of those tones were gradually increasing. the Hahul's lessons had not been without avail, while the mother's love and an intuitive perception of the potent charm that swayed the heart of her boy helped her to profit by them. Her difficult and brilliant themes had given place to pensive songs. The music echoed in plaintive tones through dimly lighted rooms, adding a tenderness to the mother's heart. At last, she gained confidence to enter into an open contest, and one evening a strange combat went on between the manor and the stable. From the shaded barn with its overhanging thatch, gently quivering, came the trills of the pipe, while advancing to the encounter from the open windows of the mansion, glittering in the moonlight through the leaves of the beech trees, echoed the full ringing chords of the piano. At first, neither the boy nor Joachim, prejudiced as they were, deigned to pay any attention to the learned music of the mansion. The boy even frowned when Joachim paused and impatiently urged him on, saying, "Come, play, go on playing." 3 days had not gone by when these pauses grew more and more frequent. Joachim often laid his pipe aside to listen, and the boy, forgetting to urge his friend, listened also. Finally, Joachim said in a dreamy sort of way, "That is fine. Listen, that is a fine thing." And then, in his dreamy, absent-minded way, he took the boy in his arms and carried him through the garden to the open window of the drawing room. Joachim supposed that the gracious Anna was playing for her own amusement and would take no notice of them. But Anna had become aware that her rival, the pipe, had been silenced. She realized her victory, and her heart beat with pride and joy. Moreover, her displeasure with Joachim had entirely vanished. She knew that she owed her present happiness to him. He had shown her how to regain the devotion of her child. And if her boy were now to receive from her new and valuable impressions, they would both owe a debt of gratitude to their teacher, the peasant piper.